March 19th, 1944. 14:37 hours. 22,000 feet above the Bavarian forest. The air was thin and bitter cold. Ice crystals danced in the slipstream. 10 Messerschmitt Bf-109s hung in the sky like dark birds of prey, their Daimler-Benz engines humming in disciplined formation. Below them, the American bomber stream stretched across the horizon, a steel river of B-17s and B-24s glinting in the pale afternoon sun as they pressed deeper into the Reich. The German pilots waited. They had done this 100 times before. The trap was perfect. The box formation, Die Falle, they called it, was designed to envelop any escort fighter foolish enough to chase a decoy. 6 aircraft formed the walls. 2 held the ceiling. 2 more waited below, ready to snap shut the moment the enemy dove through. It was mathematics. It was science. It was proven. And then, through the crystalline silence of altitude, came the sound that every Luftwaffe pilot had learned to dread, the deep-throated roar of a Packard Merlin V1650 engine wound to full combat power. A single P-51 Mustang, silver skin flashing like a shard of American steel, was coming straight at them. Not around, not away, through. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. The German flight leader, Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, a veteran of 217 combat sorties, keyed his radio. His voice was steady, almost bored. "Er kommt, halten. He's coming, hold." They held. But what happened next would be told and retold in ready rooms and interrogation huts from France to the Eastern Front. What happened next would make Hartmann question not just tactics, but the very nature of the war they were fighting. In the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had entered a new and merciless phase. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a doctrine of daylight strategic bombing, an approach the British had abandoned after suffering catastrophic losses. The logic was simple, if brutal. American bombers would fly in massed formations, protected by overlapping fields of defensive fire, and destroy the industrial heart of Nazi Germany in broad daylight. Precision, discipline, overwhelming force. But the cost was staggering. In the autumn of 1943, during the raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. 600 men. The cold mathematics of attrition threatened to break the entire campaign. The bombers needed protection. They needed range. They needed a fighter that could match the Luftwaffe's best, chase them to the deck, and still have fuel to bring their pilots home. They needed the P-51 Mustang. By March 1944, the Mustang had begun to tip the balance. With its laminar flow wing, its sleek fuselage, and above all, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built. Under license by Packard, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It could dogfight. It could dive. It could hunt. And in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was faster, more maneuverable, and longer range than almost anything the Germans could put in the sky. But speed and range were only numbers. What terrified the Luftwaffe was something else, the pilots flying them. By the spring of '44, American fighter pilots were no longer the green, uncertain boys who had stumbled into combat a year earlier. They were veterans. They were aggressive, and they had been trained with an abundance of fuel, ammunition, and flight hours that German pilots could only dream of. They had learned to think not in terms of survival, but of dominance. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann knew this. He had flown against Spitfires over Britain, Yaks over the Eastern Front, and Thunderbolts over the Rhine. He knew the weight of numbers, the grinding inevitability of American production, but he also knew that tactics, discipline, and experience could still matter. The box trap had worked before. It would work again. It had to. Second Lieutenant James Hal Ridley, 23 years old, from Amarillo, Texas, did not know he was flying into a trap. Or perhaps he did, and simply did not care. His P-51D, nicknamed Prairie Fire, bore 14 small swastikas stenciled beneath the canopy rail. 14 German aircraft destroyed. He was 3 kills away from becoming an ace twice over. He had joined the 8th Air Force in the summer of 1943, survived the brutal attrition of the winter, and emerged as one of the squadron's most aggressive pilots. His flight commander once wrote in a fitness report, "Lieutenant Ridley does not wait for the fight to come to him. He goes looking for it." That was not always a compliment, but Ridley had something many pilots lacked, an almost preternatural understanding of energy management. He knew what his aircraft could do, and more importantly, what it could survive. The P-51 was fast in level flight, true, but it was a demon in the dive. Its clean airframe and sturdy construction meant it could reach speeds that would tear the wings off a Bf-109 or snap the tail off a Focke-Wulf 190. Ridley had tested this more than once in the vertical chaos of dogfights where altitude was life and hesitation was death. He knew the Mustang's dive limits better than the engineers who built it. And on that cold March afternoon, high above Bavaria, he was about to prove it in front of an audience that would never forget. The Germans saw him first. A lone P-51, perhaps separated from his flight, streaking in from the northwest, too high to be a bomber escort, too fast to be lost. Hartmann's wingman, a young sergeant pilot named Erich Volker, called out the sighting. "Einzelner Mustang, 10 Uhr hoch, single Mustang, 10 o'clock high." Hartmann acknowledged. The trap tightened. The two top-cover 129s rolled inverted and began a shallow dive, closing the ceiling. The four aircraft forming the sidewalls turned inward, engines roaring. The bottom two began a climbing spiral, ready to catch anything that tried to dive through. It was a killing box, 6 miles wide and 3 miles tall. No one had ever come through it alive. Ridley saw them, all of them, and he smiled. There is a moment in every fighter pilot's life when instinct overrides training, when the calculus of angles and energy states collapses into a single, crystalline certainty. Ridley had that moment. He did not pull up. He did not turn away. He pushed the stick forward and dove, hard. The Mustang's nose dropped like a guillotine blade. The airspeed indicator spun past 300 knots. 320, 350. The wings began to shudder. Frost rimed the canopy edges, the engine howled, and Ridley kept the throttle firewalled. He was not evading. He was attacking. The German pilots were stunned. Erich Volker would later tell interrogators that his first thought was that the American had been hit, that the Mustang was out of control, that they were watching a man die. But the dive was too precise, the angle too steep, the speed too deliberate. And then the Mustang's .650 caliber Browning machine guns opened fire. The tracers arced downward in a glowing stream, slashing through the center of the box formation. Ridley was not aiming at any one aircraft. He was shooting at all of them, daring them to hold position, daring them to flinch. And they did. The two 129s climbing from below broke left and right, scattering to avoid collision. The top-cover aircraft hesitated, their dive angles now too shallow to intercept. The side walls wavered, and Ridley, traveling now at over 400 knots, punched through the heart of the trap like a silver bullet through silk. He came out below them, 2,000 feet lower, still accelerating. He pulled back on the stick, felt the G-forces slam him into his seat, watched the horizon spin, and climb back up into the fight. Hartmann could not believe what he had just seen. The American had not evaded. He had not run. He had attacked their formation, 10 aircraft, with a single ship dive so violent and so fast that the trap had simply collapsed. The geometry had failed, the mathematics had lied, and now the lone Mustang was climbing back toward them, guns blazing, as if the entire Luftwaffe was an inconvenience. Hartmann keyed his radio. His voice was no longer steady. Kam durch die Kiste, alle Flugzeuge, freier Kampf. He came through the box. All aircraft, free engagement. The formation dissolved into chaos. 10 109s, now scattered and disorganized, chasing one American who refused to act like prey. The dogfight that followed lasted 4 minutes. In aerial combat, that is an eternity. Ridley rolled and spiraled, using the Mustang's superior turn rate and energy retention to keep the Germans off balance. He fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition, hitting 2 109s and damaging a third. Erich Volker, the young sergeant pilot, made the mistake of trying to follow Ridley into a vertical scissors maneuver. The Mustang could climb and turn simultaneously. The 109 could not. Volker stalled out at 9,000 feet. his propeller clawing at empty air, and Ridley put a 2-second burst into his engine cowling. Volker bailed out over the Izar River, his parachute blossoming white against the dark pines below. Hartmann, desperate now, tried to set up a head-on pass. It was a tactic of last resort. 2 aircraft, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour, each trying to kill the other before breaking off. Most pilots flinched. Ridley did not. He held the trigger down, felt the Mustang shudder as the Browning cycled, and watched the 109's windscreen explode in a cascade of plexiglass and blood. Hartmann broke hard right, trailing smoke, and dove for the cloud deck. He would survive, but he would not forget. And then Ridley was alone again. The remaining 109s had scattered, low on fuel and morale. He climbed back to 20,000 feet, found his squadron, and escorted the bombers home. He never filed a combat report that mentioned the box formation. He never spoke of it except once, in a letter to his younger brother, years after the war. "They tried to trap me," he wrote, "but the P-51 doesn't trap, it cuts." What happened over Bavaria on March 19, 1944 was not an anomaly, it was a symbol. The Germans had entered the war believing that discipline, experience, and tactical superiority would outweigh the Americans' material advantage. They had expected green pilots in inferior machines, flying bomber escort with no stomach for the close-in knife fight of aerial combat. They had expected, in short, that American pilots would fight like Americans from the First War, brave perhaps, but clumsy and easily outmaneuvered. What they got was something different. What they got was Hal Ridley and 10,000 pilots like him. These men had been trained with a largesse that seemed almost obscene to Luftwaffe veterans. While German pilots in 1944 received perhaps 60 hours of flight training before being sent into combat, American pilots received over 200. They flew until the aircraft became an extension of their bodies, until aerobatics were second nature, until they could dogfight in their sleep. They had fuel to burn, literally. They practiced gunnery with tens of thousands of rounds. They learned not just to survive, but to dominate. They were taught that the sky was theirs, and that the enemy was simply an obstacle to be removed. And the P-51 was the instrument of that dominance. It was not the best fighter in every category. The Spitfire turned tighter, the FW-190 hit harder, the Bf-109 climbed faster at low altitude. But the Mustang was the most complete package: speed, range, firepower, durability, and above all, abundance. By the spring of 1944, Republic, North American, and Curtiss were producing over 1,000 fighters a month. The Luftwaffe could not replace their losses. The Americans could replace theirs twice over, and the German pilots knew it. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann returned to his airfield that evening with a damaged aircraft, a dead wingman, and a rattled squadron. He wrote in his diary that night, a diary later recovered by Soviet forces and translated in 1947, about the American pilot who had broken their trap. He did not know Ridley's name. He did not need to. "He came through the box," Hartmann wrote. "Not around it, not over it. Through it, as if we were not even there, as if our formation, our tactics, our experience meant nothing. Perhaps they do not. Perhaps the war is already over, and we are simply too proud to see it." There is a photograph, taken 3 weeks later, of Second Lieutenant Hal Ridley standing beside Prairie Fire. He is leaning against the cowling, one boot crossed over the other, his crusher cap pushed back on his head. He is smiling. Behind him, a crew chief is stenciling a 15th swastika beneath the canopy. The photograph was published in Stars and Stripes with the caption, "Texas pilot bags, 5 in 1 week." It does not mention Bavaria. It does not mention the box. But the Germans saw it. Copies circulated in Luftwaffe ready rooms, passed from hand to hand, studied in silence. Not because of the kills, because of the smile. That smile was the same smile worn by B-17 gunners who threw Hershey bars to starving French children. The same smile worn by sailors in the Pacific who ate steak and ice cream while Japanese soldiers chewed on rice and seaweed. It was the smile of a nation that had never known hunger, never known defeat, never known the gnawing fear that tomorrow the fuel trucks might not come, that the ammunition depot might be empty, that the replacements might be 15-year-old boys with 10 hours in a cockpit. It was the smile of abundance, and it was terrifying. The Luftwaffe had entered. The war expecting to fight a European conflict, where resources were finite and every bullet mattered. They had not prepared for an enemy who could afford to waste, to throw away aircraft, ammunition, and even lives in pursuit of total victory. They had not imagined an air force that could lose 60 bombers in a day and come back the next morning with 100 more. They had not conceived of a fighter pilot who would dive through a killing box, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because aggression and confidence were simply part of his training. And so, the box trap, that perfect geometric construct of angles and energy states, became obsolete. Not because the Americans had a better tactic, because they had a better philosophy. They did not avoid the fight, they sought it. They did not conserve their strength, they spent it freely, knowing more would come. And in doing so, they broke not just formations, but wills. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had stopped using the box trap altogether. It required too much coordination, too much fuel, too many aircraft, and the Americans had learned to break it. Ridley's dive was not unique. It was replicated by dozens of other pilots in the months that followed. Some died trying, but enough succeeded that the tactic became standard. If you see a trap, go through it. Use speed, use surprise. Use the fact that you have another P-51 waiting back in England, and they don't have another 109. The war became, in the words of one German ace, a war of mathematics and morale. And the Americans were winning both. How Ridley survived the war. He flew 73 combat missions, scored 21 confirmed kills, and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice. He returned to Amarillo in November 1945, married his high school sweetheart, and ran a crop dusting business until his death in 1998. He never spoke publicly about the dive through the box, but his logbook, donated to the National Museum of the Air Force, contains a single entry for March 19, 1944. 10 109s in box formation went through, they scattered. 2 destroyed, 1 probable, 1 damaged. P-51 is a hell of an airplane. It was not poetry, but it was truth. There is a lesson in the sky above Bavaria, in that frozen moment when a lone Mustang dove through a formation designed to kill it. The lesson is not about tactics or aircraft performance. It is about ideology. The Germans had built their war machine on the belief that discipline, order, and willpower could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans had built theirs on the belief that abundance, aggression, and individual initiative could overwhelm any defense. Both were right in their way, but only one could sustain itself. The P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of American industrial might, of a nation that could build 18,000 of them and still have resources left over. It was a symbol of training that prioritized confidence over caution, attack over defense. And it was a symbol of a kind of freedom that the Germans, with their rigid hierarchies and doctrine-bound tactics, could never quite understand. The freedom to improvise, to take risks, to dive through a killing box because the math said it might work, and because the pilot trusted his machine, his training, and himself. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann understood this in the end. He surrendered to British forces in May 1945, his logbook recording over 300 combat missions and 41 kills. He was interviewed by Allied intelligence officers who asked him what he thought had lost Germany the air war. His answer was simple. You could afford to be wrong. We could not. That was the difference. That was the war. And that was why, on a cold March afternoon in 1944, a Texas crop duster in a silver fighter came screaming through a 10-plane trap, guns blazing, and changed everything. The sky remembers. It remembers the contrails fading over Bavaria. It remembers the sound of 12 Browning machine guns hammering in the thin air. It remembers the young men who flew and fought and died, believing they were fighting for different futures. But above all, it remembers this. That courage alone was not enough. That skill alone was not enough. That in the end, wars are won not by the desperate or the disciplined, but by those who can afford to be bold, by those who can look at a trap and see not danger, but opportunity, by those who can smile, even at 22,000 feet, even with 10 enemies above them, because they know that back home, there are 10,000 more where they came from. He came through the box, and the box was never the same. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.